In this podcast, I'm going to be having a look at colons and semicolons. When to use them, when not to use them. In other words, when to use a colon and not a semicolon, and when to use other forms of punctuation instead of semicolons or colons. In other words, dashes, commas, and so on. The difference first between colons and semicolons. Let's have a look at semicolons. Writers often think that a semicolon should be used when you want to pause for a little bit longer in your sentence than you do with a comma. And that's often how they are used. But more effectively, you can use them for things like balance, contrast, and emphasis. And I often think it's a good thing to go through your writing, or go through the writing that you may be proofreading, and see how many semicolons you can get rid of. In other words, how many semicolons could easily be replaced by commas without, in fact, affecting the meaning, even the shades of meaning, in any way at all. And you'll see that really the comma does the perfect job of dealing with those pauses, and that the semicolon has a tendency to be overused, and it's something that we really need to try and whittle down as much as we can in our writing. Semicolons work best when you want to suggest balance or contrast. In other words, you've got two clauses or two sentences, and you want to have a little bit of this, semicolon, and a little bit of that. Or, on the one hand, semicolon, on the other hand. So we've got those two things that are balancing up. Having a semicolon in the middle of them is the right piece of punctuation in that example. You also use a semicolon when you have two distinct thoughts that are related but are not closely related. In other words, you may have a thought that you're developing in one sentence that you want to augment or say something more about or develop in the second part of the sentence, but you don't feel it necessitates having a completely new sentence. And that's something else, of course, you need to look at, is if you're using a semicolon, can you really get rid of the semicolon and have two sentences? That's another thing that's worth looking at when you're doing your proofreading. Let's have a look at a couple of examples, and these are complex examples to start with. They concern Elizabeth Gaskell, who is the 19th century novelist, and you can see here not only the use of the semicolon but also the proper use of the colon. Elizabeth Gaskell is best known for two kinds of fiction, colon. And the way the colon is being used here, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, is to initiate a list of things. In other words, the sentence is instructing you that there are two kinds of fiction that Gaskell is known for, and the colon says, here they are, I'm going to list them 1 and 2. Factory novels set in industrial Manchester, semicolon, and prose idyls of small town and village life, set in sedate rural parishes, and the quote goes on. So what you've got here is you've got the colon that initiates a list of two things, and each item in that list, factory novels and pastoral novels, is separated by a semicolon. But the semicolon is also working there to suggest the balance between those two things, the factory novels on the one hand, the pastoral novels on the other hand. So have a close look at the way that's used there. And it's a common mistake to use a semicolon, more common than we would suppose in fact, to use a semicolon instead of a colon to initiate a list. That is to say, Elizabeth Gaskell is best known for two kinds of fiction, semicolon, and that is never acceptable under any circumstances. That's plain wrong. A better example perhaps of the way that the semicolon is being used here as an effort to bring a sense of rhetorical balance to the sentence is the second example. Gaskell always used her art as a vehicle for her belief, semicolon. Writing was for her a religious exercise and therefore permissible to the wife of a Unitarian minister. So you've got a sentence in which a thought, Gaskell always used her art as the vehicle for her belief, is continued and developed in a second sentence. Writing was for her a religious exercise and therefore permissible to the wife of a Unitarian minister. They could quite easily be two sentences. Gaskell used her art as a vehicle for belief, stop, and then writing was for her a religious exercise. The semicolon is being used here to suggest a relationship between those two things. The fact that her art was always for her about belief, And it was, in addition, something that she could do as the wife of a Unitarian minister. So that's what the meaning of those examples is there. So just to recap, don't use a semicolon when you could use a comma. Okay? Don't think of the semicolon as simply a longer pause than a comma. Semicolons have their own function and they should be used in that way. A good example of using a semicolon instead of a comma would be this one. It wasn't the heat that did him in, it was the unbearable humidity. Now, there's a tendency here to say, well, there's two clauses there. It wasn't the heat that did him in, it was the unbearable humidity. There's a nice sense of balance there. We'll put a semicolon in between those two things. But that would be wrong. I mean, the best thing to do there is simply to put a comma. It wasn't the heat that did him in, it was the unbearable humidity. The semicolon looks more, it makes you appear as a writer to be more sophisticated, but in fact it really is totally unnecessary. So in your own writing and in the writing that you're proofreading, be going through looking at those uses of semicolons. First, are they correct? And secondly, are they necessary, or could the semicolons be replaced by commas? The next issue I wanted to look at was to just do a little bit more about lists and other uses of colons, because it isn't only as a list that a colon is useful in writing. We've got this example here. The West Coast Eagles have won 4 premierships, colon, 2 under Malthouse in the 90s, semicolon, 1 under Worsfold in 2007. That's a stock standard list which begins with a colon and in which the items in the list are separated by semicolons. I should add, in fact, that if you have a long list of things, some of which are only one word, red, white and blue, for example, you know, you could say the American flag comes in only 3 colours, red, white and blue. You could have a colon after 3 colours and then have red, comma, white, comma and blue. So you could use commas instead of semicolons when you're making your list after you've used your colon. But let's just look at a couple of examples of how colons might be used. A colon can be used in much the same way that a semicolon is used, but for more effect. It's a stronger piece of punctuation, in fact, and it's one that's used much less often in sentences than semicolons are. And the proper place to use it is where you want to make an emphatic point in the second clause of your sentence, but that point or that thought relates very closely, is dependent upon what has come before it. Now, when we used a semicolon to split those sentences into 2 and develop the thought, as it were, the first thought, that which is in the first sentence, there was no need for us to put the semicolon in and add the second clause. That wasn't a necessary thing. But if you're using a colon, it has to be necessarily, what comes after the colon has to be necessarily related to what has come before it. And that sounds confusing, but if we look at an example, I'll give you a clear idea of what it is that we're talking about. This example is bigger, stronger, taller, faster, smarter, and yet, oddly, more stupid. Colon, they're today's footballers. Now that is a colon being used for rhetorical effect there, where the second clause, they're today's footballers, relates very closely to what has come before it. In other words, today's footballers are bigger, stronger, taller, faster, smarter, and yet oddly more stupid. And that inversion has been made there, and that's been followed by the colon has been used, followed by that clause, in order to add emphasis and to make the point rhetorically, as well as making it semantically in what it is that the sentence is saying. If you were to use a semicolon in that sentence, it would have to be in this way. If you look at the example that's on screen now, bigger, stronger, taller, faster, smarter, and yet oddly more stupid, comma, today's footballers are a mysterious lot, comma, with their fast cars, trophy wives, huge salaries, and the unreal expectations of their fans and sponsors. So that's just using commas and developing the sentence and developing the thought in the sentence as it's going along. Alternatively, you could just put a full stop in and make 2 sentences. They are bigger, stronger, taller, faster, smarter, and yet oddly more stupid. Stop. today's footballers are a mysterious lot with their fast cars, trophy wives, blah, blah, blah. So we've had to add information in order to make those two sentences work independently of each other, but they do perfectly well. But that's a good example of how you might use colons for emphasis and not just to initiate lists. But the important point about this is to never misuse semicolons for colons or colons for semicolons.